Welcome to Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. I'm Deremy Duff. I'm joined by my tag team partner, the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Jose Ruiz. What's going on, man?
What's going on, Deremy Dove? How you doing, man? It's good to be here.
Definitely, man. It's doing pretty well, doing pretty well. And you know, there's been a lot of good feedback from our Andy Reid
Yeah,
Legacy Revisited episode. A lot of good conversation about where he ranks currently, and what defines a great coach. What are the parameters? Everyone can have different parameters for what defines greatness. And we've mentioned our tier system, and it kind of led that with something that happened very recently. A passing of another Hall of Fame coach led to you suggesting this episode topic. So I wanted to know what kind of was the genesis behind you wanting to talk about top coaches who haven't won a Super Bowl.
right, Deremy. And it was just like kind of what you mentioned. It was just but our thought process has been with Andy Reid and his success, and now he's won a couple, right? Because if we would have done this episode 3, 4 years ago, you know, he would have probably been the first person I thought of when it came to this type of episode. But March 11th, the great Bud Grant passed away. So again, it just made me think like, man, like everyone, and you talked about being a successful head coach, and we always think of success as like winning championships, and that's what you want to get to. Any player, any coach, that's what we want to do, right? But what about these guys that haven't won a championship? We always hear about like these great players like Marino and all these other guys who haven't won a Super Bowl. But what about these great coaches that have did not were not able to win a Super Bowl but had a ton of success, right? There's three Hall of Fame coaches there's three NFL Hall of Fame coaches who have not won a Super Bowl. I'm sure a couple of them will be on this list. I know they're on there for me, and even for them to get to the Hall of Fame without winning the championship says a whole lot about these coaches. But again, like when you think about coaches who were never able to win the big one, a lot of people, the first person they think about is Bud Grant, right? With those Viking teams, those great Viking teams in the 60s and 70s, they went to 4 Super Bowls, didn't win any of them, right? And so it just had me thinking, what I'm saying? Like, who are the best coaches, again, to never win one? Because you talked about the tiering system, and ironically with Andy Reid, like that, where we had him at, we had him in our tier 2, but very close to tier 1. But at that point, he didn't win any Super Bowls, and we were saying it. If he would have won a Super Bowl, he's going to get bumped up. I think some of these coaches on our list today, if they were to win at least one Super Bowl, I think the conversation would be a lot different, for sure, about like their legacy and all that stuff. So I'm excited to do this, and again, like it's unfortunate, right? That the idea came from an individual and he passing away, and but again, I think it's a good conversation. I think it's a good list to be done.
Right, and before we get into the list and criteria, and speaking on Bud Grant, someone who I've been, and it's ironic. There's three guys who have been inducted into the Canadian Football Hall of Fame and the Pro Football Hall of Fame, and we're in a way we've done episodes on Warren Moon as one. We did an episode on Marv Levy. Check the archives for those.
Checking.
And now we're mentioning the third person, Bud Grant, and just he's someone who, and he is worthy of his own separate episode. Just how
Absolutely.
fascinating
Yes.
he was of a man. And there's a statue of him up with the Canadian football team that he was with. I didn't know he was, until March 11th, he was the oldest living NBA champion,
Yeah.
which is something, that was really cool. So this guy was a tremendous athlete, at the University of Minnesota and everything before becoming this Hall of Fame coach in two separate leagues. So it's just phenomenal what his story was. And honestly, the Vikings, we know them as a team. Yeah, obviously, they haven't won the Super Bowl, but we know them as over the years as a pretty good organization. They've had stretches of maybe it hasn't worked out, but a pretty good organization.
They're in a
All
good
that,
stretch now. You know what I mean?
yeah,
Like,
and they're in a good stretch now.
Yeah.
And all that starts with Bud Grant. When you look at the most important people in Viking history, who's on the Mount Rushmore, number one, the end all be all, is Bud Grant and
Yep.
what he did for the team when he got there, but really the organization is he transformed that thing all around. And sometimes not even I mean, the last three he had Fran Tarkenton, but in '69, getting to the Super Bowl in Super Bowl four, he had Joe Cap, who,
Yeah,
you know,
who
I
only
think
played like 2 for
you
them.
and I could throw a better spiral than Joe Cap. No offense to him, but he was just all guts and glory out there. No ability, honestly. So
Yeah, he had no arm. As I mean, it's not like I was watching him or we were watching him play, but if you read back on it, it's like this dude had like he was throwing lollipops up there. Um, but that just speaks to what type of coach he was. Now that Vikings team was loaded as well, especially defensively, and we all know that. And we can get into that a little bit later. But no, I agree. With everything you talked about with Bud Grant, especially being that Mount Rushmore, he's the number one person when you think about the Vikings. When I think about the Vikings, yeah, it was interesting, like you said, like he was drafted in the NFL and NBA. So again, that just goes to show you what type of talent he was, what kind of athlete he was. And it was I didn't find this out until like getting ready for this show. It's like he didn't join the NFL. He was like a first round pick. I think he was like a top 15 pick or something like that.
hmm
14th or something. And he chose the NBA. You know what I mean? First, and he played 2 seasons. Then he called the Eagles, drafted him, and then he called the Eagles and started playing with them. It's just he has an interesting story for sure, and I agree. I think he could be a separate episode on his own. The one thing that I love about him, and just listening to a lot of interviews from former players and things like that, and what we hear about, especially in the NFL, coaches putting in like those 15-hour days.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And with Bud Grant, you didn't get that with Bud Grant. Like Bud Grant knew, like he said it. He said coaching was his job. You know what I'm saying? Like, but he had a family. He needed to be there for his family, and that's super commendable, especially coming from someone who had a lot of success. Right now, one can argue if he was putting in like those crazy NFL coaching hours, maybe he has a little more success. Who knows? I don't know, but I'm trying to. I can't remember who. I don't know if it was Tarkenton or not. It was Frank Tarkenton, and he was saying like Saturdays before the game he was out hunting. You know what I mean? Bud
hmm
Grant was out hunting, and that's again like that. A lot of these coaches, man, we talked about a lot of them on this show. Dick Vermeil to start, like with that burnout and the amount of work they put in. I have another coach on my list who's known for that, right? And it's like NFL, like a head coach, that's not your life. You know what I mean? Like it's a lot of these guys, it becomes their life. You know what I'm saying? And for him, he knew where to separate that. You know what I'm saying? And I respect that a lot.
No, absolutely. And he had a big family, and
Right?
there's
Like six
very
kids or
few.
something.
Yeah, I know later on Tony Dungy had the same approach of like,
Yep.
hey, it's not your life, and hey, not Bud Grant wanted that for his players and those assistant coaches to get home, to be spend time with them, and honestly, I don't think it would have mattered
Yeah, I don't think
in
so.
looking at it because you got to look at who, and I know this will be part of the episode. Bud Grant lost to the 16 in the Super Bowl, 69 Chiefs, one of the great teams of all time. To me, a top 20 NFL team.
Right. Very
Uh,
quietly, it's one of the greatest teams ever.
the 73 Dolphins completing that back to back. Coming off, they had the perfect season in 72. A lot of times, those players say they felt they were better in 73.
Yep.
They go back then in 74. That's the first of the Steel Curtain dynasty to those Steelers. And then they lose in 76 to the Raiders,
Right.
Oakland Raiders, John Madden, that
What a
first
great
Super
team.
Bowl.
Yeah.
So it's like there's not a stinker in the bunch of who they lost to. So I don't think it would have mattered. I think, they were playing against, I mean, some of the all time teams in NFL history. And you can look at it, maybe not individually for a season, but three of those four teams really are like top 10 team. I think outside of the
Oh
69
yeah.
Chiefs, the next
Yeah.
three are top 10 teams of all
Right.
time.
And then he's got to get through like Dallas. You know what I'm saying? And then we're talking
Right.
Tom Landry, and he's losing to Dallas in NFC Championship games. Like it was a difficult, very difficult like road to get to the Super Bowl. And then when you get to the Super Bowl, you go against these all-time great AFC teams. So again, like a lot can be said. Going 0-4 in the Super Bowl, and again, we'll get into this. But he did a great job. He was a great coach for sure, and it's a shame. Obviously, he passed away. He was, lived a long life, but it was a great life.
And I think something we kind of hit on it when we did Andy Reid Revisited, and it's something that fascinates me with all coaches is it gets downplayed, and I understand because ultimately, sports is competition, so it is about who is the winner. Like that is like championships, who won, who lost. That's why we care. That's why we're into it.
Right.
As fans. So yes, if you are a champion, that needs to be looked at the highest level. You got the ultimate goal that everyone is going for. But there's a lot of coaches in all sports, but we're sticking to NFL, who they turned around a culture of losing, and made it to a winner, or they started a culture that was never there. And sometimes that coach who maybe did not win the Super Bowl or win a championship, they took a franchise that was more downtrodden, more just, hey, it was a mess all around from the players to the front office. No one understood what it took to win a few games, let alone have continued success. They started from a bottom more than a guy who did win a Super Bowl. And I'm not saying that then you should take away from the Super Bowl winning coach, but I think it kind of gets lost sometimes with evaluating coaches. It's like, hey, this guy turned around some franchises or a franchise that they didn't know how to spell the word win. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely. And you look at what happened to the Vikings after he left. You know what I'm saying? It's not like they continued all the success. So I think, to me, again, it goes to show like what type of coach he was. But and you mentioned it, Deremy. Like we definitely touched on this. What, like, a successful coach also wins championships, but just shifts the organization. You know what I'm saying? Like, and we were talking about, Pete Carroll did it in Seattle, I feel like. And I know people go to Mike Holmgren to kind of look at like what changed the Seahawks at that point. And they had a nice little run there, but when Pete Carroll came, like, you look at the Seahawks organization completely differently, right? There's so many. You look at the Eagles differently, the way Andy Reid left them, and the Chiefs. It's crazy he did it in two organizations, right? And just there's so many coaches that we can look at that we're like, oh wow, like not only were they successful, but they put this organization on the map. We can look at Vince Lombardi, and a lot of people didn't even know where the hell Green Bay was. You know what I'm saying? Like, but we know where Green Bay is now, and it was because the success that he started there, and obviously continued on for years and years and years. So it's not just about winning. It's the culture, and I think
And I
when you shift the culture, that's something different.
no, and I look at like because you take out like he's won and stuff. I look at like Dick Vermeil in Philadelphia,
Right.
where that was you got like, hey, 1960 they won a championship out of nowhere, but then for the next rest of that decade, all into the 70s, it's hey, 16 years of losing when he comes in, and it was just downtrodden. And the reason why it's successful now, honestly, starts with what Dick Vermeil did to get that team. And they didn't win a championship, but we know from being from Philly, his impact was felt generations afterwards. For they got to the Super Bowl, but hey, he made this a winner, and he made this a place you wanted to go. I think about Jim Mora with New Orleans first. The Saints had been around. They were the Aints and the bags over the heads on Monday Night Football. It was a mess. And then Jim Mora comes from the USFL, brings over some USFL guys like Vaughn Johnson and Sam Mills, and they become, hey, the Dome Patrol. They don't win a playoff game, but they become perennial winners in getting into the postseason. And they had 20 years of losing in New Orleans. It was a mess. Indianapolis, he goes there. They draft this young guy named Peyton Manning. They're 3-13 that first year with Mora as coach, but then the next year they have, I would say, behind the greatest show on turf, Rams '99, the '99 Colts had maybe the second greatest turnaround ever, 3-13 to 13-3. Jim Mora was a part of that. Now you look at it, Indianapolis, that's a football place, but
Right.
in the '90s that was all basketball.
Right. And the Colts were a laughing stock. Like you talked about the Saints, and those are two stops that a lot of coaches didn't even want to they didn't even want to take on. right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a difference of like a losing, like you're going through some losing seasons, or like it's just a losing organization and culture. You know what I'm saying? Like, and again, you mentioned the Aints and and Archie Manning running around for his life and throwing passes up and scrambling like crazy because there was there was no talent on the field. And then the coach you talk about like Jeff George and Eric Dickerson and all these guys like playing on that team when they were in the AFC East and they were just getting blown out every year by Miami and Buffalo and the Jets. So it was like an easy win. Them in New England, those are the two wins that like those teams chalked up 3 or 4 wins easily with those two franchises. So again, like I think that speaks a lot to the individual. And then what's funny is, and we talked about it as well in our last episode. It's like, and I think you said it too, Deremy. It's like they may not even see like that championship, but again, another coach comes in and just kind of like just continues it and just cleans up a few things and then gets them over the top. I always think you talked about Dick Vermeil in Philly. I look at Dick Vermeil in St. Louis, and it's like we hired Mike Martz, and it's like, yeah, Mike Martz is going to just continue everything, and there's a difference of like continuing the culture and all of that stuff, which Dick Vermeil was doing and did, to like just continue to be a good coach and like keeping the same players. It's two different things, and I think what Mike Martz is supposedly was just genius coach, but cannot get him over the hump again like Dick Vermeil did. So I just think, again, you can be a really good coach or a great coach, but also know how to build franchises. That starts to separate you from just the X's and O's guys.
And you know who's one I'm really curious about is a current coach. He's not on my list, and we'll get to the list soon. But I'm curious to see what Dan Campbell in Detroit does
Right.
after the
I'm
year
rooting
he
for him.
had.
I'm
I'm
rooting
rooting
for
for him big time. And man, if he can get this team to some playoff berths and maybe even like a playoff win or
him.
two,
They were close this year.
they were really close. And that's why I have my eye on him, because he doesn't need a Super Bowl for me to be like, yo, that's one of the great coaching jobs in
Right.
sports history if he can turn that place around. So I'm like, I have my eye like on that, because that's as tough of a job to me as we've seen in a long time, turn around the Detroit Lions. And I mean, I was highly impressed with what I saw this past year, and my eye is on them to be like, man, they can get in there and do something. Scott, like he'll be
They got a
a
chance.
statue.
Right. He deserves one for sure.
Yeah,
There ain't no Wayne Font statue anywhere. You know what I mean? Like
no,
they need a Dan
no,
Campbell one if he gets them to the playoffs. I mean, just look at they're close. They just gotta get some defensive players. They got a great O line. They got a nice tandem at running back, some good young wide receivers. You got a decent quarterback. It, Aaron Glenn on the defensive side, he's blitzing like crazy. I love that, and they need some pieces. You got your guy, Aiden Hutchinson. You know what I mean? He's a good player. He's a decent
hmm
player.
yep.
No, he's going to be
Representing
good.
Michigan,
He's going to be good.
so
He's not any like a Bosa or anything like that, but he's getting there.
he'll be better than Bosa. That's right.
Maybe the brother,
More. Mm-hmm.
maybe the older Bosa.
Oh, okay. But no, it's interesting to see, and let's get into the list here. So was it how easy, how hard was it for you to kind of whittle down your top five?
It was. I think for like that fifth one, like that last one is always the hardest one, right? Like how many lists we've done here, Deremy, and it's just like it's always like, does this guy deserve to be on this list, or is it someone else, someone kind of currently? Like I don't know, like, but for me, it was that I think it was just the order I was putting these guys in. You know what I mean? Like I kind of knew like three, maybe four that I had in mind right off the top of my head. But again, like I had to do a little more digging, and but yeah, it wasn't as hard as I thought, to be honest. And again, if you're thinking again, this is Super Bowl era, just kind of like clear it up, Jeremy.
Right.
Not with you, but with just everyone that's listening.
No, I'm glad.
Yeah, and it's just again, this is Super Bowl era, so obviously from '66 and up. So if you're thinking like obviously like George Halas, Curly Lambeau, Paul Brown, some of these coaches are not going to be on here, right? Because they didn't have the opportunity to win a Super Bowl. But we're not talking NFL championships, anything like that. This is strictly Super Bowl wins. This is more, I don't want to say modern era, but a lot of these coaches we're going to hopefully recognize. But I just wanted to say that as well. You know what I'm saying? Because obviously those three would be on probably the top of our list, if we were going to do it that way. So, Um,
And for me, Sid Gilman, I'm going to count winning the AFL championship
right.
before the Super Bowl. So that's why Sid Gilman is not on mine.
Mine either.
He would be on mine, but I'm count. He won the AFL title before the Super Bowl in '63 with the Chargers, and I'm going to count that one um, as a pro league. He was a champion. So for those wondering, that's why if we kind of went a little bit back, then Sid Gilman probably would be on my list too, but he's not because I will consider for this discussion winning that AFL title like that. That excludes him. That was pre Super Bowl era, so that excludes him.
Right. Right. No, that's a good one there. Um, all right, Jeremy. So I'll let you start it off. So we'll go from number 5 to number 1, and what we'll do is once we start rolling, this will be our top 5. We're not going to list to list. We're just going to add top 5, and then we're just going to add the 5, and then we can talk about who we left off or anything like that once we're done. So I'll let you kick it off, Jeremy, with number 5.
Number 5 for me just got Hall of Famer Don Coryell. We look at what he did with Air Coryell and that offense and how influential it was. We see what he did with like a modern kind of what we saw with the Greatest Show on Turf, and we did our episode about that. Mike Martz really was a guy who kind of took everything from his learning was from Don Coryell, and a lot of it kind of comes from it. Even honestly, a spin on what North Turner did with the '90s Cowboys. It's a spin on what
Right.
Air Coryell did. This is about pro football, but we look at his coaching tree. He's got Joe Gibbs on it from college. He had at San Diego, with the Aztecs. San Diego, I believe, State. He had Coryell and Madden.
Yep.
Madden as his D coordinator, and Joe Gibbs was working the offense. And we see, Joe Gibbs learned from him when he was in San Diego. So they, had Dan Fouts, what the modern tight end to me, a big thing that we see, Kellen Winslow.
Yep.
That was with the Chargers. They never got that over that Super Bowl. They had some tough championship game losses. Losing to Oakland at home in 1980 was tough. Then they had the Freezer Bowl and
That's the one right there.
in '81, that Freezer Bowl where they go to Cincinnati and how cold it was. And, hey, it's a team game, but Ken Anderson, he outperformed. He was ready for the cold. Dan Fouts wasn't. So, he has a couple of championship game losses. He battled with, the Raiders in that era, the 70s into the 80s. But I got to look at it and just give it to Don Coryell as my number 5, honestly, because of modern offenses. And you look at it, I think the godfathers of modern offense, you got to look at a Sid Gilman, a Don Coryell, and a Bill Walsh.
Yep.
As those guys who really kind of what we see today, the biggest impact are those 3 guys. So I got to put Coryell on there for that reason.
No, that's a great number 5 for sure. And again, we always talk about legacy here and what this individual left behind, and what he left behind again was the system, and the system has been tweaked a little bit, but the system works, and it was working in modern football. It was working back in the '80s, so that's a great number 5.
What you got, my man?
For number 5 or number 4?
Are we going? I want to see who you're.
My number 5 was another guy we talked about, shifting cultures and franchises and things like that. And then my number 5 was George Allen.
Okay.
Yeah, and what he did, the job he did in Washington, and I mean, obviously he had a lot of success with the Rams and stuff like that. Early on, right in the '60s, you know what I mean? Like he had a lot of success. He won a couple Coastal Division titles. I forgot that there was a Coastal like that. That was a long time ago. But again, you look at the teams that he lost to, and he lost to Green Bay, in the NFC, in the championship, in the conference championship game. He loses to the Vikings 2 years later in '69 in the conference championship game. Like, so he was running into. We talked about, Bud Grant running into some juggernauts. Like, he was running into some juggernauts too as a Rams coach. But then he goes to the Washington Redskins, which they were known as the Redskins back then, and George Allen just kind of immediately shifts the culture of that franchise. And it's funny because he was coach and player personnel. So that's you don't see that a lot anymore, especially because that those people, a lot of coaches can't handle that. And what he did there, it's almost like what teams are doing now, and it's just like we're not worrying about draft picks. We're going to sign
Yeah.
we're going to sign some veterans here and bring them in, and they're going to do what I'm going to do here, and they're going to run my system. We got the Over the Hill gang with the Redskins back in the day, and he had a ton of success there. And again, he lost to that Dolphins team in '72, in Super Bowl VII. So obviously the Dolphins were great that year, obviously, and his team didn't play well in the Super Bowl. But I mean, if you look at the next year they lose again to Bud Grant and the Vikings, and then '74 he loses to that in the NFC divisional game to the Los Angeles Rams, and then the next couple years he loses again to the Vikings. So we these coaches are intertwined for me, because you're going to see a lot of them running into each other, in the playoffs and stuff. But he had a crazy winning percentage. I think his winning percentage was 710 or something like that. 712. He was 116 and 47. But in the playoffs he was 2-7. You know what I'm saying? Like, so, all that winning during the regular season, I think in my list is going to be a lot. You're going to see a lot of that. You know what I mean? Like a lot of regular season winning. When it comes to the playoffs, the situations were a little different. I think, George Allen was one of those as well. So that was my number 5.
No, that's a good one. I think George Allen, one of the great characters in NFL history. That was the problem, though, was he was his own personnel guy, and he didn't like to have young players. And I do believe if he would have developed some young players, I think it would have helped him. And I think that Over the Hill gang and that mindset, it kind of hurt him later on, because he didn't, the guys kind of would tire out. They do well in regular season, burn out when it came to playoff time. So I think that always kind of was tough. But George Allen, he was right outside. He doesn't make my list, but I great coach, well deserving of the Hall of Fame. So I do like that one, though.
And he was one of those original coaches that was putting in like 16 hours, and he kind of started that like hardworking, coaching is my life type of thing, and he was great with his players. His players loved him. We all see the highlights, them in the locker room with the 3 for the Redskins, hip hip, and all that good stuff. And those guys loved them. But again, that's going to take its toll on you. You know what I mean? Like working all those hours and dedicating yourself. He had like, the office and the bedroom and all that in the office. Like, you can't do that. I mean, but he had success, and you can't knock it. But yeah, that was my 5, number 5.
Yeah. Okay. My 4. I'm going to good old Marty Ball. I'm going with Marty Schottenheimer.
That's my number 4 too. Yeah.
Okay. This guy with over 200 regular season wins. There's one of few guys to be able to do that. And that's where it's impressive. And to me, it's the consistency of what he was doing. I think you mentioned it before in a previous episode, the way he was a leader of men. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what I always loved about him. And that culture building that he did, it worked it worked with Cleveland. It went to Kansas City. Kansas City had been losers for years. Post that Super Bowl IV win, it was a long drought. And Carl Peterson saw that the Browns had made a mistake in firing Marty Schottenheimer after what he did there and getting them to some championship game appearances and really winning that AFC Central a lot. Carl Peterson, said, hey, I need a coach. He brings in Marty Schottenheimer, and instantly the Chiefs become one of those teams of the 90s that is consistently winning, the AFC West and getting into the playoffs. There's a lot of playoff heartbreak there in Kansas City. But, hey, the Chiefs, those teams that he had, whether you look at the early part of it with Okoye and Neil Smith and Derek Thomas and those guys, and, he has Marcus Allen at running back. It's just those were – I always liked those 90s Chiefs. He had Albert Lewis, Deron Cherry. Albert Lewis was great. Great player. So it's you look at what he did in San Diego.
Right.
And what he did with Drew Brees. And I think for me, that's what happened in 2006 is probably – I'm going to ask you, since he's your number 4. For me, that's the biggest heartbreaking loss, is the 06 one. And he had a lot of heartbreakers. But I look at that was his time that was his time to be. And I do believe if they get that win and they hold on over the Patriots, I think they are world champions. So I think that was the closest one for me. So, but you go on about Marty since he's your number 4 as well.
No, I think yeah, you made great points, and I would argue the Ernest Byner fumble was probably like that had to be crushing, but that 14-2 Chargers team, they were good. You know what I mean? Like, and folks thought they were going to the Super Bowl, and I thought they were going to the Super Bowl. That to lose at home, to New England, that was a brutal loss. And I know LT was nicked up apparently and all that stuff, but even you talked about Drew Brees, what he did for Drew Brees, what he did for LaDainian Tomlinson. Like he LT was going to be a great player anyway, but Marty was just feeding him and feeding him. He had over 400 touches, like 100 times that, you know what I'm saying, like for Marty. But like if you look at this, and you talked about, Carl Peterson knowing that the Browns made a mistake, right? Like just think about it. After '88, well, the Browns weren't doing much. You know what I'm saying? Like, and then you look at they were better than the Broncos in '86. You know what I mean? Like I thought, and then '87 you got the drive. I might have got those mixed up.
'86 is the drive. '87 is the fumble.
Yeah, and so you got '86 that drive, and that's Elway doing Elway stuff, and I'm a big Elway fan, and and then that '87 that fumble with Ernest Byner, that's crushing. That's a crushing blow, and but that Cleveland team was really good. You know what I mean? They were good, and they won. They won the division 3 years in a row. In '88, they were in second place. They lose to Houston in the playoffs. The Oilers, which obviously, if you're a young buck here, we're listening to us, and you're looking at the Tennessee Titans, and then you talk about Kansas City, and they running into the Bills a couple times. In those playoff runs, and losing to them in '93 in the championship game, losing them to them in the divisional in '91. And then again in '97 they lose to Denver. And they went 13-3. That was another crushing one as well. But that 2006, that was Marty's shot, and I love Marty Schottenheimer. The Gleam. That's like one of my favorite NFL films clips. And I would love to play for a guy like Marty. You know what I'm saying? Like he looks like he's definitely a player's coach. He's the ex-player himself, so he knows what it takes. And I just wish, man, Marty could have got one. You know what I mean? And I do. And I think he is one of these coaches that if he gets that one, we're looking at Marty Schottenheimer.
Yeah.
Totally different. We're definitely not looking at Marty Morningway like this, but he's not on my list, Marty Morningway. But
good.
But Marty Schottenheimer, we're looking at him completely differently. He's talked about as one of the greatest of all time, and even still, without the Super Bowl, he's still talked about as one of the best coaches ever.
Well, I got 2 questions for you. So first off, should Marty Schottenheimer be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame?
I absolutely, I think so. 200 wins, like you mentioned. Not a lot of coaches are going to get that anymore. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to be able to last that long. Like you got the Andy Reid's, the Pete Carrolls, the Mike Tomlins. That's not happening too often. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I don't know how many coaches are going to get to that number. But yeah, I think Marty definitely belongs in the Hall of Fame.
And number 2 question for me is not overall because he's 4 on both of our lists, but as far as if let's go, Jose, you bought, we could pick any franchise. You bought this. You're the owner of this franchise, but they have, just a history of losing. I mean, 20 years of losing.
Right.
Where does Marty rank on, hey, you need a coach to come in here and turn this place around? For the people who are on your list / who you consider to be on this list, where do you put Marty on just for I need a coach who can kind of turn it around? Not saying he's going to get you to the Super Bowl or anything, but he's going to whip it into shape. Where do you put Marty on that list for you?
He'd probably be top 3, maybe 2 or 3, on my list, especially looking at these guys who I got on here now. But, yeah, I mean, just, again, because we've talked about this here. We talked about it in other episodes where I don't know if he's the best X's and O's guy. You know what I'm saying? I'm not sure. I know we talk about Marty Ball, and it's just run the ball and don't turn the ball over, play great defense. That style of play is successful. You know what I mean? And but you got to put up points as well. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I just think, especially with him, especially with Kansas City, he was running into like some better offenses in the Bills and stuff like that in the playoffs. But to like and this is like such a cliche, but to like galvanize the troops and the players and things like that. He's that, you know what I'm saying? Like he'll have guys playing hard. He'll get the best out of a lot of those players who a lot of other coaches won't do that. And I just think the way he approaches the game and the way he approaches like a team, he's out of these guys. I think he would be like one of my top two for sure.
I think he'd be at number one, honestly, just for not saying he's not the best, but just for if you have a losing, and I mean not just like you said earlier, you have a couple of bad seasons in a row. I mean you have a losing culture where it's a decade of just bad GMs, bad draft picks, bad previous coaches.
Yeah,
Fans are just done. Ticket sales are down, and you need someone who's going to come and whip this thing into shape. I think Marty's my number one of guys who haven't won a championship. He's the guy where I'm like, you know what? I don't know what the end result will be, but he's going to whip it, and we're going to have a product that you're proud of, and he'll get you to the playoffs. Like Marty's my number one of just that culture builder, and like everything you said, he's just a leader of men, and it's about the fundamentals and the discipline and all those things. Now, maybe that creativity kind of hurt him, or lack of creativity, I should say,
right,
hurt him playoff time, where he was just
right.
3 yards in a cloud of dust and just always on field. And like you said, those things are important, but it's always sometimes you have to take chances.
Yeah.
You have to go for it, and it was always that field position play and kind of sticking too close to the vest. That is what I felt like hurt Marty. But I just think this guy is something that needs to be in the Hall of Fame because, and it's a shame he's passed away. And so if he gets it, he wouldn't be here. Same with Don Coryell as well.
Right.
But it's just like Marty deserves to be there because he did that for a lot of franchises.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And yeah, I love Marty. I love Marty, and again, I think he definitely deserves to be in the Super Bowl.
So who's your number three?
My number three, surprisingly, when I say surprisingly, I didn't. When I think of this coach, I don't really think of him like as one of my top guys who've never won a Super Bowl. But like after doing a little bit of digging and stuff like that, I was like, this guy belongs on my list somewhere. I put him over Marty because he's gotten to the Super Bowl. You know what I mean? Like if not, I would think Marty would be over him for me. And this is Dan Reeves would be my number three. Again, we talk about Marty over 200 wins. Dan Reeves is at 190. He's right there, right behind him. People forget Dan Reeves has been to 4 Super Bowls as well. He's 3 with John Elway, and then 1 with that Atlanta team in '98 or '99 Super Bowl. But we don't, and we look at Dan Reeves as just like kind of like a, he got the cowboy like accent and stuff like that, and we don't really look at him as like I don't really think of Dan Reeves as like one of the great coaches, right? But when you start to look at his resume, man, like he had a lot of success. I would say definitely early than later. Because later it just kind of shifts and it doesn't look as good. That one run with the Falcons again in '98, but after that was pretty much it in Atlanta. But I forget he coached the Giants as well. And when he got to the Giants, they went 11-5, and they lost to San Fran in that divisional game. That was in '93, yeah. But in Denver, man, I know he had Elway, but they had a great run in Denver for sure. And you look at in '83, they lose to the Seahawks in the wild card game, and then '84 they went 13-3. They lose to Pittsburgh in the playoffs, right in the divisional. But he's got from '84 to '87, and if you skip '88, which we can't, but if you do, and even '89, they're double-digit wins. So they're double-digit wins almost every year when he's there in Denver. Obviously in '86 they get blown out by the Giants in the Super Bowl. '87 they get blown out by the Redskins in the Super Bowl. '89, they lose to the 49ers in the Super Bowl. And then '91 they get to the AFC Championship game, they lose to the Bills. And again, like I don't know if that Denver team was the best team in the AFC those years, especially those early Super Bowl appearances. I just talked about the Cleveland Browns. I think especially in '86, Cleveland was a better team. But he got his team to the Super Bowl. And if you look at that Denver team, especially like offensively, you got John Elway and you got John Elway. You know what I'm saying?
Pretty
Like,
much, yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
The three amigos.
right? Yeah, yeah, yeah. They had zero running game in Denver those years. Elway wasn't there. So what he did, taking those teams to the Super Bowl, I think is very impressive. Again, 190 wins. He was 11-9 in the playoffs. So obviously, you get to 4 Super Bowls, you're going to have a winning record. But again, 0-4 in the Super Bowl, which is really tough. And again, that does not get talked about. We talk about 0-4. We go to Bud Grant. We go to Mark Levy. A lot of people don't talk about Dan Reeves making 4 Super Bowls as a coach. So for me, my number 3, Dan Reeves.
Yeah, Dan Reeves is my number 3 as well. And I think you got to give credit to honestly, maybe the most impressive job he did was the 98 Falcons.
Oh, yeah.
And getting, Jamal Anderson, Chris Chandler as a quarterback.
Chandler. Oh, my God. Yes.
Terrence Mathis and all those guys.
They robbed us of one of the best Super Bowls ever, probably.
I think so. I think that would have been – if there's always that list of best probable or possible Super Bowls – it's that 98, would have been Super Bowl, what was that, 33, I guess?
I don't know.
Yeah, Super Bowl 33 would have been, it should have been the Vikings and the Broncos, and we'll never know. That would have been great. That would have turned a lot of legacies around. I always feel for Gary Anderson on that one. But, and it was we knew when Atlanta won, the Super Bowl was done.
Yeah. But ironically, he loses to John Elway. He loses to Mike Shanahan, him and Shanahan had this big rift in Denver.
Well, I think that's what honestly marks him. Will be right. What will hurt him is he had a bad relationship with John Elway all those years, and I think it was an ego thing and a power thing between the two of them. A lot of people say John Elway was difficult in those years too, so I'm not going to put it all on Dan Reeves either. And some people say Mike Shanahan did try to finagle because he winds up firing Shanahan as an OC because he says Shanahan was a divider between them. And we know that Shanahan and Elway had a great rapport and they would reunite and everything. But I kind of look at that as maybe what could – I don't know because I don't think they beat any of those teams who they faced in the Super Bowl, but – I just look at could it have been better for him if he was on that same page with John Elway? Who knows? But I think we did 98 with those. That's not a good team.
No,
you know what I mean?
Like they don't just make it. Like they go 14-2.
And and
Dirty Bird, like all over.
Yeah, exactly. Jamal Anderson, that Dirty Bird, and he got hurt shortly after that. Wasn't much, but I mean it took the Vikings went 15-1. Because it's crazy to go 14-2 and you don't have home field advantage throughout.
Right.
So that's what it took. So I think we talk. A lot of people, not we, but a lot of people talk about those Broncos teams with Dan Reeves. I think the most impressive Super Bowl appearance, probably to me, was that '98 Falcons. So I
mean, even if you look at '99, like the next season they go 5-11. Like so that's it was like everything went right for that team, but he did a great job coaching them.
And had a heart attack during the year and everything too.
Yeah.
So it was impressive. Do you think he should be in the Hall of Fame as a coach?
I do too. Like I definitely do, man. I think he's done enough, man. Like 190 wins again. There's not going to be a lot of guys that top that. And you make 4 Super Bowls. I understand you need to win them, but you get there. You know what I'm saying? The other 2 coaches who made 4 Super Bowls, who lost 4 Super Bowls, are in the Hall of Fame. So I think he definitely deserves to be. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I would give it to him. I think so, and I think it's like you said, he's forgotten. Even though Bud Grant wasn't allowed personality, those Vikings teams had personality, and the Purple People Eaters and stuff. And we know about the Bills and Marv Levy.
Fran Tarkenton.
Yeah, Fran Tarkenton. So I think that helps, and I think those Broncos teams, we just know them as they got embarrassed.
Right.
In those Super Bowls, and the Falcons are forgotten. So I think he just goes under the radar, but I think he should be in the Hall of Fame. Do you think he should be in over Marty Schottenheimer? Who should be first? If you were a voter.
I think Dan Reeves. I would put Dan Reeves in. And I just said how much I love Marty Schottenheimer, but Dan Reeves got to 4 Super Bowls. You know what I mean? Like that, I think that elevates him a little bit, in my opinion. Playoff record much better than Marty. You know what I mean? Like, but the thing with Dan Reeves also, it's like, and I'm not saying this is to like knock his Hall of Fame candidacy, but like, what are those teams known for? You know what I'm saying? Like these, like a lot of coaches who we remember, like their teams are known. Like even Marty's, like Marty Ball, like we know what that's about. You know what I'm saying? Like you talked about like some of the other coaches we always mention, right? Like what are Dan Reeves teams known for? You know what I'm saying? Like, and it's just John Elway. He's known, his team are known for the player. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like in that, I don't know. I think that's why it's easy to forget about him.
So are you saying like that? You mean like no, like they didn't have their own identity?
Right. It was just like, yeah, like I don't even, like I can't even tell you what that Broncos team, what they were like. I know they were like, I know they were good offensively, right? You got Elway, he's throwing the ball everywhere. They're not running it much, you know what I'm saying? Like in Denver, but like if I go to like Marv Levy or something, like I just think of like the Bills and the K gun and all that. And I'm not saying it was because of Levy, but it's just like they had no identity, I guess I'm trying to say. And even that Falcons team, I do remember the Falcons team for like Dirty Bird and Jamal Anderson more than that Denver team. You know what I'm saying? Like, and what I don't understand like the identity of that Broncos team. Like I just don't remember any.
Do you think that's right? Like, do you think that's like? I'm not. I'm just wondering because I think it's a great point. I think you made a great point, and I just wonder because we are bigger, so legacy matters
Right.
sometimes. Just almost as much as the result in our eyes. The result's number one, but the legacy is a close second right there.
1A.
So it's like, do you think because like you look at Don Coryell in the Hall of Fame
Right.
now. But does not have the success of a Dan Reed as far as a head coach in the NFL at least. You look at like I think Marty would get in before I've heard Marty's name talked about.
I have too. Yeah.
So do you think that's right though that because his teams don't have that certain identity? I mean, like, is that a fair assessment or not a fair assessment, a fair judgment?
I get what I know exactly what you mean. Like I don't think so at all. Like, because he even doesn't even have like, if you look at like the coaches around like where he's at when it comes to like winning percentage and things like that, like another one that strikes me is like Chuck Knox is another one who's like close to like, but I'm trying to think of their identity as well. It's like like Jim Mora. You mentioned Jim Mora. Like we know who Jim Mora is for not only like turning these franchises around, but like clips and like press conferences. Like we can go back and remember who Jim Mora was. Dennis Green, like Bum Phillips. You know what I mean? Like guys like this who haven't won a Super Bowl but are talked about a lot more. It's just like even like Steve Mariucci, who's like 100 wins under. Dan Reeves, right? But we all know Mooch from like TV and stuff like that now, so his name is relevant still. But it's like these guys, I can go back and remember, like, I remember, like, you know what I mean? Like with Dan Reeves, I go to Denver, right? And I go to the issue with Elway. I go to them getting blown out in Super Bowls. Then I go to them in Atlanta and just riding Jamal Anderson like to a Super Bowl. And honestly, it's not even like, it's more Gary Anderson missing the kick. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's
True, yeah.
And it's not like they went in there and beat the Vikings. We all feel like the Vikings lost that game, So I just think with some of these coaches that they get forgotten about, it's just their teams don't have an identity. I don't know. I could be totally wrong, but I don't.
No, I think for Dan Reeves, it's a great point. Because I do think there's other coaches who aren't on, probably, I don't want to assume, our list, but they're more known and they do, like Sam Weish, Jerry Glanville.
I was thinking Sam Weiss too, like
Buddy Ryan.
Right. There's a lot of coaches that you can remember more than like guys like Dan Reeves, and that's a shame again because he had a lot of success. The thing is, his success, as we remember, is not success, but a lot of failure as well. And I think the failure sticks out more. But I mean, that it could be the case with our next two guys, who I think are the next two, but.
Yeah. So go ahead with your number. No, because Dan Reeves my third. So who's your two?
Marvin Levy, my guy. You know what I'm saying? Like, and I know we did an episode on these Bills, and I talk a lot about Mark Levy for sure.
You're one of the biggest fans,
I,
Bills fans.
I set you up for that. That was an alley there.
Yep.
But no, man, and it's just not NFL success. It's just coaching success overall. I mean, if you look at his NFL, numbers, let's just say, win loss record, he's 143 and 112. But we all, we think about all the success that Bills team had. All the success they had. I'm going to say that again.
Mm-hmm.
But you mentioned as well, like Canadian Football League Hall of Fame. He's only one of two coaches to win a Grey Cup and get to a Super Bowl. Is Mark Levy. So he had a lot of success in Canada. And then he goes to Buffalo. He goes to Kansas City. He goes to Buffalo. And then we all know what happened in Buffalo, right? Like they had some great teams there, and he was another one that I don't really think of Mark Levy as like an X's and O's guy. I think of him more of like a, like to rally the guys and get them, ready to play, and more of like definitely like a player's coach and an emotional coach and all that. Like, but a great coach overall, right? And knows how to handle his players and things like that. He just could not get over that hump, right? And if you add the CFL like coaching record and things like that, he's at 191 wins as well. So I think again that he won, I think, 2 Grey Cups, something like that in Montreal. So I don't know if there's much more like I can continue to
Well,
talk about.
look, no, we know we have the same. So our top 2 names are there. So
Right.
I'm gonna just ask you then. So why? So we know Marv is 2, Bud Grant's 1 for you. So
Yeah.
why? Some people may say why both lost 4 Super Bowls. Marv went to 4 in a row. Bud Grant did not do 4 in a row. Why do you take Bud Grant over Marv Levy?
Because I think like with Bud Grant, and we were talking about his success earlier, and it's like, his run, that Bills run was amazing, right? Like obviously, I'm a big fan of it, but that Vikings run was just as good. You know what I'm saying? Like they didn't go 4 in a row, but we talked about some of those teams they lost to in the playoffs. We talked about them running into Dallas. We talked about, them losing to the teams like that they lost to. Like I don't look at in the Super Bowl. Excuse me. I don't look at those teams the Bills lost to, especially the Giants team. That '91 Super Bowl, they should have beat the Giants. That Vikings team beats the Giants. You know what I'm saying? Like those Vikings teams. I mean, with Bud Grant. Now, obviously the Redskins and in '91 or '92, and then those Dallas teams. Obviously, those are great, all-time great teams. So, I mean, I guess it's the same conversation you can have as well with Mark Levy. Is like he ran into some juggernauts as well. So to me, I just think the success is a little longer for Bud Grant. You know what I mean? Like, and you look at, he's making the playoffs in 1980. With Minnesota, they lost to the Eagles, and then the strike shortened season in '82. He's still making the playoffs, and if he started in Minnesota in '67. You know what I'm saying? Like, so I just think the longevity there. I think for sure. I look at that Bills team, and I don't think Marv Levy is the most important aspect of that team. I think Ted Marchibroda is like just as important offensively.
Okay.
I don't look at that in Minnesota. I think Bud Grant is the reason why they were successful. That was my difference there.
No, it makes sense. I will say this: before Bud Grant passed away, I probably would have it flipped. I would have had Marv at number 1. Um, since Bud Grant, we're recording a couple days after he passed. It really didn't. I knew a bunch about Bud Grant. I knew the team. I've watched the clips. I watched America's Game, the Missing Rings on the '69 Vikings. But listening to some people who are Vikings team historians these past few days talk about Bud Grant has the impact of the Vikings to this day and how they operate as a franchise. You can link back to Bud Grant, which I did not know.
Right.
I didn't know that he had that kind of lore over the franchise. I knew over that era. I didn't know. Then you go to the Jerry Burns and Anthony Carter in the late '80s, to Dennis Green in the '90s, and then so on throughout the 2000. Like Bud Grant still has a looming of how the Vikings operate as a team. The Viking way is really the Bud Grant way.
Right.
I did not know that, and that kind of made me flip it and change it because much as Marv Levy and what he did with Buffalo, and that the '90s Bills do have a lure over the franchise still. I wouldn't say it's that kind of we operate the same
Right.
as what Marv did back in like the '80s into the '90s. Bud Grant from like you said '67 still is the most important guy. A lot of people say he's up there with like Prince as like Mount Rushmore of most
Ooh,
important people
that's great. That's great company, man.
in the state of Minnesota. So like he's looked at, he's a national treasure, in Minnesota. So I will agree with you that Bud Grant's number one. But I can be honest, it is sad that it took his passing.
Right.
I knew his great legacy. I could have taught. We did his episode a couple months ago. I off the dome, I would have went on about what Bud did, who his teams were, his great players, the tough losses. But just like listening to people talk recently, I was just like, I did not know that he had that much of an impact on the Vikings to this day.
Yeah, it's amazing. That's why when you see like that one clip, I can't remember what year it was, where he came out with the polo shirt and it was freezing in Minnesota.
Yeah, that was like 2014, I want to say, or 2015.
They weren't in a new stadium; they were still outdoors. So obviously,
they lost to that was the Seahawks.
I think so.
That missed field goal.
Yeah, that was like Adrian Peterson. Yeah. And it's like, that was such a big deal because again, like he's so beloved in Minnesota, and he's known for that. Like he's known for like, making the players tough in Minnesota and not providing like the heaters and the sidelines and letting them know. And you can see the players during the interviews, like the way they talk about that. It's like they actually believe that they were beating teams mentally as well. You know what I mean? Because again, like they were showing like they were coming out with the, like short sleeves and stuff, and it's like minus 20 degrees in Minnesota. And other teams are looking at these guys like they were crazy, man. But
right.
You talked about like the Bud Grant or the Viking way, like you got like the Viking formation. When the national anthem is played, like all these guys are standing there, they're not chewing gum, they're holding the helmets on the same side. They're all lined up together. Like he started that, and he was saying he was like the national anthem is very important to me, things like that. And it's just like that continued on. You know what I'm saying? Like, and that just again shows the mark that he left on the organization, not back in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, but again, like you mentioned, to this day. So yeah, and you know how I feel about Marv Levy. Marv Levy is one of my favorite coaches of all time, but I think Marv had more talent I think the Bills have more talent than his Vikings team. And we talk about, that great defensive line, that great defense Minnesota had with the Purple People Eaters, but offensively, you have Frank Tarkenton and not Malchel. So if you look at both of those teams, I think the Bills were a little more talented, so he had much less to work with.
He had a little, Ahmad Rashad as receiver.
He did.
He had some Pro Bowls.
He did. I forgot about him.
Little Chuck Foreman.
Yeah. They had good players on offense. What I'm saying is, if you compare it to like the Bills, so if you flip flop those teams, and it's like you compare that Bills offense, like Hall of Fame wise, like it's probably the same amount. No, probably more, because you have 1, 2, 3, 4. Is Ken Hall in the Hall of Fame? I can't remember.
No, Ken Hall's not in the Hall of Fame.
Should be in the Hall of Fame.
He should. I agree.
You got 4 offensive players on Buffalo to like. I think Minnesota, Purple People Eaters had 3 defensive players like in the Hall of Fame. Then you got.
They should have another one.
They should have, yeah. And
Jim Marshall.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you got Frank Tarkenton on offense. I'm trying to think that you got Bruce Smith on defense as a Hall of Famer. So it's it kind of balances out when it comes to Hall of Famers. But again, I think the Bills had more than the Vikings did, and I just think he got more out of his players, and Levy had better teams.
And you look at, I remember for our Joe Gibbs episode, you brought up coaching trees. Pete Carroll, member of that coaching tree for Bud Grant, as well as people forget, Buddy Ryan was an assistant, coached those Purple People Eaters. So, I'm not gonna say it's the most impressive compared to like what you see with Walsh and Parcells and some Andy Reid now. Some of these guys.
Marty had a nice one too.
Marty does have a good coaching.
Yeah,
Marty has a very good one. Dungy. Bill
Bill
Cowher, he
Power, yeah,
definitely has
Herm
some good
Edwards,
ones.
McCarthy's
Yeah.
on there. Yeah,
So Marty, so these guys were teachers. Marty, I think of a teacher,
yes, yeah,
Marty
that's a good
is
point.
up there.
Yep.
He was a teacher. Um, I just always feel like as I get older, it's important to look at those guys who turned it around in whatever men, women, in whatever sport, who built that culture, turn it around.
Right.
And it is just so hard to go in from the ground up. And I don't think we realize that a lot of times you can kind of point to winners, and not that the layers were built for them too, to an extent at time. Not all the time, but a lot of times there was things that were built for them, and they should be praised. But I mean, if we want to mix and match sports, like Phil Jackson, the Bulls were built. Now, he got over the hump, and I don't think they do that without Phil Jackson in
Absolutely.
basketball
Yeah.
for the Bulls or the Lakers. But it was built, and there's a difference sometimes, and when you're
Because
building
I
it from
also look
nothing,
at right. I agree 100%, and I also think and we talked about it during our Last Dance episodes. Check the archives.
check them.
We talked about like it's hard to coach really good teams too, like and to keep that success and to get over the hump with great teams. That's hard to do and keep them motivated and keep them going year after year. So I think that's like another level of this conversation. You know what I'm saying? Like we talk about building and or taking over teams and I think taking over a great team and then making them better and then keeping them there. That's now you're talking different levels there.
No, I think I would say that's harder.
I agree. I agree.
And I think that's why but they get the praise.
Yeah.
When you're winning, it's kind of hard to find coaches who have won, especially have won consistently, and they're not praised. They're not
Right.
talked about a lot. I do just think in certain sports, not that they're the greatest coaches, but in some of the cases, like man, they did the greatest coaching jobs I've ever seen. And I mean, one example I think of in college football, I thought Bill Snyder at Kansas State.
Yeah.
I'll never call Bill Snyder the greatest college football coach, but for where Kansas State was
Yes.
and ready to get rid of the program, and for what he took that program to, where he was putting his own money into getting new weights and everything, and he ran off so many guys. Bill Snyder has a statue in Kansas State, and he should have statues,
Yeah.
plural. Like sometimes it's just impressive to do that, and I think I love talking about that with you, Jose, because it's like that's hard too. And I think I look at it even in my day job sometimes, and looking at it, it's like it can be hard going to an established place and trying to make that work, an established company. But hey, I know we've done some jobs even together. Hey, this podcast is like we're taking it from the ground up, and it's a lot of work and it's a grind too. So it's just great to kind of see the difference. And I think I've talked to people who feel like it's harder to work bad to good than to maintain the good, and I understand where they come from with that.
So do I. Yeah, and I think that's why everything you just talked about there. I mean, I feel like the all-time greats, the coaches that we always remember and will never forget, build it and then take it to the end. You know what I'm saying? Like and get it to like the Super Bowl or the championship game, whatever it is. And I think those are like the all-time greats of like the greats of greats. Like those are the ones that the Lombardi started from nothing and then got them to like this amazing Super Bowl run and things like that. And Parcells and all these other great Andy Reid we talk about, like Bill Walsh, like all these guys started it and then got it to where they needed to get to, and then you got the championship. And I think that's why those guys are always never forgotten about, which is absolutely deserved. But we want to do this episode for the guys who we don't really think about, and the guys who never got to win the championship or the Super Bowl, but deserve to be talked about in the same conversation because they've done a lot of great things and not just losing in the championship game or not getting to the Super Bowl. They've done a lot of great stuff. A lot of these coaches I would definitely have run my organizations, you know what I'm saying? Like, and there were some that we didn't even talk about, you know what I mean? And still, like, even not talking about them does not, like, I don't want to disrespect what they've done, you know what I'm saying? Like, just because they
Yeah. No, and it kind of got named. Bum Phillips is in there. What he did, he ran into the steel curtain. Without the steel curtain, I think Bum Phillips has
Right.
a few Super Bowl appearances. Sam Weiss was a Montana drive away from probably being a Hall of Famer.
Yeah.
I think that Super Bowl title in '88, if it's not Montana to Taylor, I can see, especially with the innovation in that no huddle, Sam Weiss looks a lot different. So I
Especially
just
now,
really do.
especially with teams now using it so much. Like, you know what I'm
Mm-hmm.
saying? Like, it's just what he did. It was before its time. And I know the Bills kind of did it and took it
They
to like
copied it.
it took it to a different level of success. But like now everybody does it now. You know what I'm saying? Like teams do it to get their quarterbacks like in a good rhythm, and it's just people forget like those Bengals teams with that. I forget what it was called. It was like the shorter huddle or whatever it was. They were a great offense too. And
Mm-hmm.
coaches like that. We talked about like Chuck Knox and the longevity of his career. You know what I'm saying? Like and the success that he had, especially with the Rams and stuff, and him running into Bud Grant a couple times. The Cowboys team, they went to 3 straight NFC Championship games. You know what I mean, from '74 to '76, and then he lost to the Vikings again the year after that in '77. So we all just remember. A lot of people remember him in Seattle, and then at that point in time, Seattle was nothing. You know what I'm saying? Like, and he had success there. So a lot of good coaches, man, that didn't win a Super Bowl. A lot of great coaches. Chuck Knox won over 180 games, I believe. Yeah, he won 186 games. So that's a lot of coaches are not going to get to that. Who are coaching today. But again, that just shows that his greatness. Well, I won't consider Chuck Knox a great coach, but he's a really really good coach, and you don't coach for that long and not be a good coach.
No, I think of John Madden's quote, a line he said. He said when he was coaching, a lot of people say you haven't won the big one yet, and he says, "Show me a game that's a little one." So that's the truth. There's when you're winning because there's no little. We know the Super Bowl's the game you want to
Right.
get to, but there's no little game. So Chuck Knox winning 190 something games. Same with all the other. Marty winning over 200. Dan Reeves winning over 190. They're winning big games. There's
Right.
no like they didn't win a big game. No, they're winning big games to get to that point. So this is fun, and I encourage everyone, if you don't, if you haven't, by the time this episode comes out, do just little. You can even look up. There's been some cool podcasts, some Viking team podcasts that I've listened to, but research Bud Grant
Yeah.
and research all other coaches on this list too. But Bud Grant was a fascinating guy, and I think, like we've kind of mentioned, a lot of those leadership skills that we're seeing today, not just coaches, but leaders in companies, supervisors, CEOs, they're kind of doing what Bud Grant did, but Bud Grant did it back in the 60s when it wasn't kind of the
Right.
most popular thing to do. So, do research on this stuff because it's fascinating and it's help. I know it was for me. So,
Right, and nowadays with like post pandemic and things like that, people always talk about life balance and work life balance and things like that. Bud Grant was on that in the '60s. You know what I'm saying? And when a lot of people when it was just about hard work and work all these crazy hours and not just in regards to NFL coaching, but in life in general, right? Like we have to always work is work. You know what I'm saying? Like that's one thing I was taught with my job, which I love my job for teaching me that. It's like when work's done, like we got to move on and move on to the rest of our move on to life, right? Then that has to shift, and he was one that knew that. You know what I'm saying? And again, I think in knowing that some people look at me when I say stuff like that I'm crazy, and no, I'm not crazy, but you know what I mean. Like it's a lot of people just still think it's like I got to work hard. Folks work from home. It's like I'm working crazy hours. Like no, like when my shift is done, like I'm a hard worker. Jeremy, I know you're a hard worker. I've seen it
mm-hmm.
firsthand, and it's like, but we both understand like when work's done, like work's done. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, and I can respect that Bud Grant was the same way with having a ton of success, with having like a lot of pressure put on him, but he knew when to turn it on and off. And I just think a lot of coaches, not even in the NFL, just coaches in general, college, high school, have a tough time with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let us know what you think about our list. You can hit us up at Bigger Game Pod on Twitter, Bigger Game Pod on Instagram. You can follow our YouTube channel, Bigger Than the Game with Deremy and Jose. And you can find our YouTube channel there, and also you can find our podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. So for the man, the myth, the legend, Mr. Jose Ruiz, I'm Deremy Dove. Thank you guys for listening. Take care.
Peace.